Yes, ma'am.
I have some show and tell.
Okay,
May I come up?
sure, absolutely.
Um, Whoever was asking there about the weather, it's 83 out, it's sunny, it feels like
I
83.
have here
And the
the
humidity is
I
low,
Like Ike song,
29%.
written by Irving Berlin.
Oh my gosh.
Can you open it for
Sure,
me?
no problem.
I won't sing it for you. But my dad had it, and I can remember him playing it for us and all of our company who came in the door. And then this one, Old Soldiers Never Die, is actually the lyrics of what MacArthur said. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. So that was also something that he said.
Also put to music.
It put to music.
Very
So,
interesting.
yes,
Very cool.
thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing it.
Yes.
That's extra credit for you.
Oh.
Because I knew you'd be asking. Thank you very much. It's great to be back. Welcome to part 4 of our 6-part presentation looking at the United States in the Cold War, American foreign policy from 1945 through 1972. And we were talking last week in terms of the Korean War and the formal end of the presidency of Harry S. Truman. And from the standpoint of Truman, as far as he is concerned, as he's leaving the White House, history would be kind to him. He was very, very confident in that. He did the best he could. And in fact, he proved to be correct, as we referenced last time. It's very interesting that you have, quite frankly, 3 very effective presidents here in American history, and one right after the other, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt, through the Great Depression and the Second World War, onwards to his successor, Harry Truman, through the Fair Deal, which was his domestic political plan, comparable to FDR's New Deal, but not as exhaustive, not as large or as prominent. But also here, the origins of the Cold War and the new role that the United States would be invariably playing here as the 20th century continued. And then onwards as well to Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican from the state of Kansas, from Abilene, Kansas, though he was born in Texas in the late 19th century, in Denison, Texas. He was born here as one of 7 boys. He was actually the 3rd of 7 here in the family. And his parents were both very devout Mennonites, completely and utterly opposed to violence. It's the ultimate pacifist, quite frankly, right up there with the Quakers, to be perfectly frank. And the ironic thing of Dwight Eisenhower's upbringing is both of his parents not only attended a 4-year college or university, in fact it was where they met at Lane College, but they also both graduated. Now it was fairly rare for anyone to have a bachelor's degree in the 1880s, 1890s. About 2% of the population, in fact, formally had one. But it was even more here unusual, or even more of a stretch for women to have a bachelor's degree here in the 1880s or 1890s in the United States. In fact, the vast majority of the population never went beyond here 8th grade or 6th grade in many instances, depending on what decade you're in fact formally looking at. Well, both of his parents had bachelor's degrees, but the irony of it all, as Dwight is born here, the 3rd of 7 boys, is that the family is very poor. The family here is, in fact, very poor. So they will move to Kansas. They're going to become farmers. And as Dwight Eisenhower reflected back earlier, or I should say later on in his life, he said the reality is that we were dirt poor. But the beauty of it for us 7 boys is we didn't even realize it. Okay? We didn't have any clue whatsoever. Well, what happens is for the family, the 7 boys are very, very close. And all of them went by the nickname of Ike. There was Big Ike, there was Little Ike, there was Tall Ike, there was Ugly Ike. How'd you like to be known your whole childhood as Ugly Ike? Hey, here comes Ugly Ike. Hey, how's it going? Very good, thank you very much. There was simply Ike, which was the 3rd born, Dwight Eisenhower. The question oftentimes brought up by his biographers, beginning with Stephen Ambrose, the most prominent of them all, is how did he get this nickname? How did the family get the nickname? Nobody knows. Was it an abbreviation? Was it just short for Eisenhower? or what in fact was the reality of it, well, it's something that's still open to a great deal of debate. Well, for his parents, despite the fact that they are very, very poor, here living in Abilene, Kansas, they are obsessed with sending their 7 boys on to college. And Dwight Eisenhower's 2 oldest brothers would both attend the University of Michigan. They both received partial scholarships, very, very bright guys. However, when it came time for Dwight to attend college, quite frankly, there was no more money in the till. So in this situation, he was not exactly sure what to do. He was going to go out and work and pay his own way through school. It was going to take him a good deal of time, but it wasn't that big of an issue as far as he was concerned. He and all of his brothers would end up being very, very successful here in over the course of their lives. Something that's very, very detailed in terms of documentation. I made reference to his brother Milton at the conclusion of our presentation last week. But for Dwight Eisenhower, he had this lifetime friend from Abilene who was actually from a very wealthy family. His name was Swede Hazlitt. And Swede Hazlitt went to boarding school at St. John's Northwestern Academies here in Delafield. At the time it was known as St. John's Military Academy. And he would come back on the summers and he would talk extensively here with his grade school pal, Dwight. And when he realized that Dwight Eisenhower was not going to be going on to college and was going to be paying his way through and working all sorts of odd jobs, etc., he said to his best friend, well, why don't you apply for the Naval Academy? Apply for Annapolis or West Point, or both for that matter. Because there, if you're accepted, it's not going to cost you a dime. You have nothing to worry about. Well, Dwight Eisenhower would follow the advice of his good friend Swede Hazlitt, who was accepted to the Naval Academy, was actually technically a year ahead of Dwight Eisenhower. And he applies here, he takes the entrance exam for Annapolis, and of the hundreds of young men who took this test, Dwight Eisenhower had the 2nd highest score of all.
Wow.
He then took the entrance exam to West Point, and he also scored the 2nd highest score of all of the hundreds of applicants. So in essence here, he has the opportunity to go either to Annapolis or to West Point. Well, he chooses West Point as opposed to Annapolis, but now he's got to break the news to his parents, who are complete and total pacifists. Their son's going to be a soldier boy. He's most likely going to be a lifetimer here in the U.S. Army. That's pretty much what he's signing on for, and he's completely aware of that. His parents are horrified, absolutely horrified. Like, oh my God, how could we have failed our son, our boy? This is the worst of all worst-case scenarios as far as they are concerned, and they tried desperately to talk him out of it. Well, Dwight Eisenhower's mind is made up, and he will set off in the train to West Point, and his mother and father, his parting a vision of both of them is that they're standing there at the train station sobbing as the train is pulling away. Well, when he goes to West Point, here he was a very strong athlete, and he really wanted to play football, and West Point at that time was playing a lot of top colleges as well in terms of football. And his freshman year, his sophomore year, he screwed around a great deal, wasn't overly focused on his studies. He played both on the football team as well as the baseball team, but his sophomore year of college, he wrecks his knee, which is pretty much going to end here all hopes of any sort of long-term career in sports. He gives up football, he also has to give up baseball, and he was a very likable guy. Everybody got along with him. He was someone who was not at all arrogant or full of himself in any way, shape, or form. He forms a lifelong friendship with Omar Bradley, who was very prominent in the Second World War. We talked about him as well on Harry Truman's staff during the Korean War. And what happens is he graduates pretty much, I'd say, above the bottom 30% of his class at West Point. However, he does well once again on this entrance exam to graduate school for this officer training school in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And there he goes, and out of 324 people over the course of the next 4 years, he graduates, I should say, at the very top of his class, 324. So intellectually, he was no lightweight. He was probably a bit lazy, so to speak, during his formative years at West Point, which Dwight Eisenhower would readily admit. Well, he is viewed early on. In essence here, he's going to fall into groups with the right people. A classic example of who you know. John Pershing, who would be the prominent supreme commander of the Allied forces in World War I, recognizes that this guy has a tremendous ability. He has a tremendous ability, though Eisenhower is training with the tank brigades here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In 1917, they're getting ready because they're going to send these tank brigades over from the United States to the western front of France. Well, just as they're getting ready to be shipped off in November of 1918, they learn that the armistice is signed and there's not going to be any action whatsoever. So he was stateside basically all of World War I. But John Pershing was very, very impressed. And what he had this enormous gift for, Eisenhower, is he had this ability to be able to see the big picture, to see the forest instead of the trees. And he proves, in essence, to be this fast riser in the U.S. Army. Well, Douglas MacArthur, who was very conservative politically and really ran in Republican circles, is going to be brought on as Army Chief of Staff here in the administration of Herbert Hoover in 1928. And he will bring along with him someone who is known for a good couple of years, and that is Dwight Eisenhower, to be his secretary, to in fact here be his clerk. Well, when Hoover loses the election in 1932, Douglas MacArthur is now going to be sent off to the Philippines, and he wants Eisenhower to come with him, to continue on here, remaining on as his clerk. Well, Mamie Eisenhower does not want to go. They had 2 boys, and quite frankly, she was sick and tired of moving. To give you an example, in their first 28 years of marriage, they moved a total of 38 times.
Oh, God.
You hear the phrase army brat? Well, this is like army brat on steroids, quite frankly. So as far as Mamie Eisenhower is concerned, the last thing she wanted to do is to go off and live in the Philippines, where the humidity was just overwhelming, etc. And she much preferred to stay at least stateside. Well, Dwight Eisenhower agrees with her, and he tells Douglas MacArthur in 1932 that he is going to remain on in Washington, D.C. and look for a different job here for the U.S. Army. MacArthur tells him that, soldier, you are making the biggest mistake of your career. And away he goes. And MacArthur was really angry about this with Eisenhower. But Eisenhower went with his gut and realized the wisest course of action was to stay behind. Well, General George Marshall, who we also introduced in this series, the Marshall Plan, remember, 1947, one of the more admirable figures in all of U.S. history, no doubt about it. George Marshall recognizes the genius in Dwight Eisenhower. And of the top 100 generals or officers here in the U.S. Army, quite frankly, in the mid-1930s, Eisenhower wouldn't even crack the top 100. He was well known, or I should say fairly well known in various circles. But George Marshall is incredibly impressed with him. And he sees him and puts him on this fast track over the course of the 1930s. And what happens is that when World War II begins and continues on, Eisenhower will continue rising. Marshall will see to that as Marshall's working stateside with the Franklin Roosevelt administration at this stage. And when it's time for this massive amphibious landing, D-Day, Marshall tells Franklin Roosevelt that he knows the perfect person for this job. And Franklin Roosevelt asked, well, who would that be here in 1943? And Marshall's response was Dwight Eisenhower. And Franklin Roosevelt barely even knew Dwight Eisenhower, but his genius is being able to see the big picture. And it will be this lad, one-time lad from Abilene, Kansas, who will plan the largest amphibious landing in all of U.S. history on June 6, 1944. He's not going to be, as a general, he's not going to be somebody who's going to be planning in terms of operations, etc. He'd leave that more to people like Omar Bradley and George Patton, etc. But in terms of setting the stage for this, D-Day, this extraordinary operation is 100% his doing. He smoked at this time about at least three packs of cigarettes a day, sometimes as many as 4 packs a day, the consummate chain smoker. He was smoking like a chimney, quite frankly, in D-Day as it was coming up, not sure if it was going to work or not. What if it doesn't work? Oh my God, what a disaster that would be. Unbelievable pressure, but it does work. And it's the signs here, the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich in the summer of 1944, as the nation of France is formally liberated from the Nazi movement. Well, what happens is he is the supreme commander of the Allied forces in World War II. And when the war ends for Dwight Eisenhower, he's tremendously relieved. He's extraordinarily relieved. He's going to go back now stateside. He hasn't been back home in over 4 years. He'll head back here to the United States to return, so to speak, to normalcy. He'll stay on with the U.S. military for a while. As he referenced the fact as well that he is going to become the president of Columbia University, has a short stint with that, but he's very, very well known, far better known than any other general, quite frankly, even more so than MacArthur, here in the late 1940s. When NATO was introduced in 1949, Harry Truman asks if he would be the supreme commander of NATO, and he agrees. Dwight Eisenhower agrees here. And what happens is that he's this fast riser now in terms of American culture and American politics, though he was always somebody who was very, very careful to steer clear of politics. When he was informed of Douglas MacArthur's firing, when he learns of this, he was very, very careful what he said. He said, this is unfortunate, but until all the information is in fact formally in, we can't pass judgment. He wasn't a big fan of MacArthur. Eisenhower was never a fan of anybody who was something of tooting their own horn and was full of themselves. In fact, he found it appalling. And MacArthur, quite frankly, many people in the upper brass, especially when MacArthur was talking about their overwhelming support for him, and quite frankly, he was wrong, it was something that privately really, really shook Dwight Eisenhower. Well, what happens is that once MacArthur retires, and now he's going to go off to fade away, so to speak, he gave a final interview, and he was asked here in 1951, about Dwight Eisenhower, who had worked for him, quite frankly, very, very closely for 5 years, and what he thought about him. And MacArthur's response regarding Dwight Eisenhower was as follows: best damn clerk I ever had. Which is a cut, okay? Because basically, your best secretary I could have ever asked for. Right? Well, MacArthur, of course, fades away. And the Democrats and the Republicans are after Eisenhower to run for the White House. Because they know here, with the most popular American of all, quite frankly, for the greatest generations are going to be heading to the polls in this return to normalcy here with the Cold War alive and well in 1952, that he keeps saying he's not interested, he's not interested, he's not interested. Eventually here, he will be drafted by the Republican Party, which is perfect for the Republicans, because they have this opportunity now to, in fact, formally return. They had not been there successful in a presidential election since 1928 when Herbert Hoover prevailed over the Democrat Al Smith. Well, in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower is going to run against Adlai Stevenson, a politician from the state of Illinois. And Eisenhower will win here with tremendous ease. 55% of the popular vote for Eisenhower, 44% to Adlai Stevenson. In the Electoral College, it was 442 votes for Eisenhower, 89 for Stevenson. So the Republicans now are back in the White House. And the first objective for the new president here of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, his first objective is Korea, is to deal here with Korea. Now, I referenced in our closing comments last week that Eisenhower was someone who wanted to give the impression to the American people that he liked to golf a lot, he liked to take naps, read westerns, and play bridge. But the reality, somebody who designated, there had never been a more prominent Secretary of State in all of U.S. history, arguably up to and including the present day, than John Foster Dulles. And John Foster Dulles was given here the spotlight time and time again to talk about U.S. foreign policy here in the Cold War of the 1950s and the growing menace that the Soviet Union, in fact, here, formerly represented as the decade progressed. Well, that was the image. And John Foster Dulles got a great deal of attention, but he was kept by Eisenhower on a very short leash. Because directly behind here, despite the impression that he's designating, not really interested, I gotta take a nap, keep it down, gotta play golf tomorrow afternoon. Right? The reality, again, was the opposite. He golfed, yes, but generally only to relax. He did not read Westerns. Not at all. Couldn't stand it. He took naps, yes, rather infrequently. He did play bridge. But what you have here is someone who is this organizational freak, going back to being the mastermind at Normandy in 1944. That hasn't changed. That was only 8 years before. And he is tremendously involved behind the scenes as this workaholic. Problem is he couldn't relax, quite frankly. He worked and 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 then he worked some more. All the time. He was heavily involved. And the reason that he is going to be viewed here as not so bright, we talked about that last time with the connection with Columbia University, but in fairness, it's also a situation that he brings on this image of a disengaged, kind of friendly grandfather type, who's not really interested in being president, but he's going to do his duty nevertheless. That's the image, and it's an image that he put forth as well. The reality was something very, very different. Well, for Eisenhower, his first great focus is the Korean War. First great focus here is, in fact, the Korean War. And what you find with the Korean War is that the North Koreans and the Chinese communists, both communist states, of course, and at this time, there was a whole question of the POWs. And the Americans had thousands, and the UN forces had thousands here of Chinese communists as well as North Korean communists. And what kept things here from being resolved went back to the early summer of 1951, and the United States was saying, if any of these guys want to formally defect or become American citizens, they should be allowed to. And as far as the Chinese communists and North Korean communists are concerned, absolutely not. Absolutely not. This would be embarrassing. It's not going to happen. It's out of the question. Well, when Eisenhower comes to be the new president here in 1953, the negotiations begin again. And Dwight Eisenhower is demanding the same thing that his predecessor, Harry Truman, demanded. This time, however, the Chinese communists and the North Korean communists say, okay, fine, we'll allow for it. And of those over 100,000 communist POWs from both North Korea and China, more than 70% of them decided to, in essence here, move to the United States and become U.S. citizens. So this had been the big, strangely enough, for the final 2 years of the war, one of the big stumbling blocks. It was resolved and an armistice was signed here on July 27th, 1953. And the Korean War was formally over, a war that took the lives of nearly 38,000 Americans here from 1950 to 1953. From that time onwards, North Korea and South Korea, just like has been the case in 1945, they moved forward, but neither of them are happy. As far as North Korea is concerned here, with now that 38th parallel, it's more of an unstable line, the DMZ line, or the demilitarized zone, as it's referred to as, up to and including present day. As far as North Korea is concerned, the Korean Peninsula needs to be unified under the communist leadership here, whoever would in fact be in power. And North Korea, in terms of its human rights abuse records, would be absolutely horrific. No doubt about that, up to and including the present day, of one of the 5 worst in the world, quite frankly. South Korea, by comparison, will become here this capitalist state, as it had been since 1945. And what the United States is going to do, which is also a strong policy for the U.S. throughout the Cold War, is they're going to start pouring a tremendous amount of money into South Korea, into this capitalist state, making it here one of the strongest nations in all of the region of Asia. Right up there literally with Japan. I mean, what happens in these nations in terms of transition, in terms of modernization, in fairness, I'm not crediting the U.S. exclusively by no stretch of the imagination, but the United States plays a very, very prominent role, a very good role. And the U.S. is doing this for political reasons because they don't want these areas to become weak and fall to communism. Well, mission accomplished here for Dwight Eisenhower. It's a fine feather in his cap. Just a few months into office, he brings about an end to the Korean War. And the Americans would see this Korean conflict as a success. Why? It's simple. The goal, the focus, the objective, going all the way back to June of 1950, was to reestablish the 38th parallel. That had basically been done. Well, the second issue, or the second great concern here for Eisenhower in 1953, into the summer and onwards into the fall, was Joe McCarthy, this senator from the state of Wisconsin, this demagogue, quite frankly. And what McCarthy was doing is he's continuing here his investigation. And from the standpoint of the Republican Party, McCarthy had played a role by this search for communists because it made the Democratic Party, it made Harry Truman in particular look weak. So you have here the start of this crusade, so to speak, on the part of McCarthy from Wisconsin. And when he's starting, it proves in essence to be very, very effective, continuing on in 1950 into the midterm elections. And the Republicans are going to increase their advantage in both the House as well as the Senate. And a lot of it was because the impression was that the Democrats were indeed soft on communism. Well, he had 205 known communists in the U.S. State Department, the names of, he claimed this on February 9th, 1950. And now it's 1953, 3.5 years later, going on 4 years later, and he has not found one communist. And as far as Eisenhower is concerned, this was nothing more than politics. And the time for McCarthy has come to an end. It's time basically to close up shop. Thank you for your service. You played a very important role. It's time to move on. Why? Simple. Because the Republican Party is in control of the House, the Senate, and now the White House. No longer needed. Well, the Eisenhower administration starts sending word to Joe McCarthy to tone it down. McCarthy ignores the warnings. He ignores here the warnings. And the second of the hardline Cold War warriors of the Republican Party, second only to Joe McCarthy, was Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon was elected to Congress in the House of Representatives from the state of California in 1946. He ran for the U.S. Senate just 4 years later, was elected here as a U.S. Senator from the state of California. And this fast riser in the Republican Party, he will be brought on to be Eisenhower's vice president in 52. So Joe McCarthy basically is going to be told by Richard Nixon, the two of them are pretty good friends, to tone it down. Enough's enough. Zip it. Your crusade, your campaign coming from Dwight Eisenhower is no longer necessary. Time to move on. McCarthy refuses to listen to Nixon. Well, what McCarthy is doing next, filled with his own self-importance, the demagogue through and through, and reading about it in the newspapers and actually seeing it in person were two completely different things. And what McCarthy decides to do is he decides to start talking about communist infiltration at the upper levels of the U.S. Army. He is directing this at Eisenhower 100%. Eisenhower is enraged, absolutely enraged. And he is told by members of his administration that what you have to do here in the late fall of 1953 is go after him publicly, take this publicly. And Eisenhower's response was, I am not going to get into the gutter with that demagogue. That's exactly what he wants me to do. He's a disgrace to the nation, and I will destroy him instead. What does Eisenhower do? McCarthy was warned one final time to tone it down. He doesn't, and instead he announces at the start of 1954 that there are going to be new hearings held in an investigation of security and communists in the U.S. Army. Well, as far as Eisenhower was concerned, that did it. Absolutely, that was the end of it. It's indirectly a showdown between these two Republicans, Joe McCarthy and Dwight Eisenhower. And with the start of the Army-McCarthy hearings, this is great as far as McCarthy is concerned because they're going to be televised beginning here in April of 1954. Well, what Eisenhower is going to do is watching here the early stages as McCarthy is browbeating, he's insulting, he tells General Ralph Zwicker, he's in his face yelling at him that he doesn't have the brains of a 5-year-old. I mean, the act just got old. And Americans who watched it on TV were horrified. Wow, this guy from Wisconsin's out of control. Completely out of control. Hey, reading about it was one thing, but to actually see the bullying tactics. And then the media would be putting out, where are the communists, Joe? Where are they? Are they in the U.S. Army? Are they behind the couch? Are they hiding in the garage? Where are they? You had 205, not one's come forward. Adding to this, as the Army McCarthy hearings are going on, the fear of McCarthy was gone. Now he was an object of ridicule. To give you an example, in March of 1954, 52% of the American public in a Gallup poll, 52% of the American public in a Gallup poll still supported McCarthy's movement. They still supported here his movement. By the end of May of 1954, as the Army McCarthy hearings have been going on for some time, we're starting to wrap up effectively, that number had dropped to 36%. He proved here to be his own worst enemy. McCarthy, to get more and more attention, would start yelling in the courtroom, point of order, point of order. And what used to be a situation that people would be silent, now they laughed at him. They mocked him. He was mocked on national TV. Well, he was demanding here information regarding the U.S. Army and various officials. Eisenhower refused the request on the basis of national security. And he also sent word publicly that no one else is to go before Joseph McCarthy for any sort of questioning whatsoever. It's over. National security. Well, Joe McCarthy ends up destroying himself on national TV. And what happens is now the tide shifts against him 100%. But as far as Dwight Eisenhower was concerned, it wasn't just a case to end this ridiculous witch hunt, that no communists were found, and indeed he never found even one communist, but also to destroy the political career of McCarthy. He's going to take it to the next level. This is all behind the scenes. And what he starts working on is a censor or a condemnation on the part of the U.S. senators to basically here go after the ultimate act of ridicule and put down. And in December of 1954, Joe McCarthy is censored, he's condemned. For all intents and purposes, his political career is over, McCarthyism is done, and from the standpoint of Dwight Eisenhower, from that time onwards, if it ever came up, he'd refer to it not as McCarthyism, but McCarthyism. So you have this individual now taking over, and again, the impression is somebody who is very disengaged. The reality is, in fact, the exact opposite. He's a workaholic, plain and simple, doing the absolute best here that he could. So he has the Korean War ending. It's a great, great step here for Dwight Eisenhower in the Cold War. The economy is also in excellent shape. The U.S. economy is also in very, very good shape in the 1950s, better than it even was in the second half of the 1940s. The sky is the limit. All economic prognosticators are seeing here that this is just going to keep rolling on. Who knows? God only knows. We're in uncharted territory. But remember, it even reaches greater levels in the 1960s here in the United States. Well, the economy is humming. It is in excellent, excellent shape. You've got this optimism across the board. And we see here examples of this looking first at the automobile industry. Now, General Motors sold in the decades of the 1950s, sold here in the decades of the 1950s, literally thousands upon thousands of automobiles. And 50% of Americans owned at least one automobile by 1953. 50% of all Americans, which was huge, a huge strike. It made it more affordable, had been for quite some time, and Americans would take advantage of this. GM would be the first corporation in world history to earn over $1 billion. By 1960, 80% of U.S. families had at least one car. And you talk about the Americans and their love of the car. Okay, it's still alive and well, no doubt about that. 80% of American families had at least one car by 1960. 15% had two or more. Another area that's impacted by this very robust economy, housing. In 1940, 44% of Americans in 1940 owned their own home. By 1945, it had climbed to 48%. By 1960, it had climbed to 60%. So you have here this tremendous transition from 1940, 44%, 1960, 60%, in the present day it's about 63% of Americans own their own home. And it would expand here, cities, now off into the suburbs. Suburbs are suddenly going to become alive and well because you've got this car that you can drive into the city for work, and you can have a large area to live in, you can have your own home, you can have your own lot, etc. It made a great deal more sense. It would help expand the economy. The baby boomers. For Americans born between the years 1945 to 1964, this was out of control. I'll give you an example. Sociologists will look at the birth rate. When the birth rate is going up for a nation, it signifies optimism. When it's going down, it signifies pessimism regarding the future. In France, following World War II, the birth rate continued a steady decline, pessimism. In the United States, the exact opposite happened. The exact opposite here happened. Remember, the United States is about the only nation, quite frankly, I would say is the only nation to emerge from World War II almost unscathed. Well, here, 4 million babies would be arriving on average each year between the years of 1945 to 1954, and then nearly 5 million more from 1954 to 1964. So you have here the cry that was heard across the land. It was oftentimes referred to as, I wasn't a baby boomer, I missed it by a few years, but my older brothers and sisters, all my brothers and sisters, I'm the baby of the family, they're all boomers. And if you were a boomer born between 1945 to 1953, you were sitting pretty. Because the economy is expanding and job opportunities, the sky is the limit, quite frankly. That was the primo time to be born as a boomer. If you're born after 1954 to 1964, there's not as many opportunities. It's still good, but there's not as many opportunities as there had been earlier because you've got the older boomers in these positions and they're not going to be retiring, quite frankly, anytime soon. Well, great reason for optimism here for Eisenhower, and his popularity with both the Republicans and the Democrats remained very, very strong, remained very high. Usually his approval rating was somewhere between 78 to 82%. Pretty impressive. Eisenhower was wildly popular. And this image, as far as he was concerned, also helped his popularity. And if something wrong happened, it would be more of a case in foreign policy that John Foster Dulles, who's front and center for all of this, he would end up taking the heat, not the President of the United States. And Dwight Eisenhower really didn't care that much about attention. What he cared about was doing the right thing for the nation as best he could. Well, the great concern for Eisenhower. The great concern here for Eisenhower was the arms race, the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And despite the fact, if you look at the rhetoric or speeches here of Dwight Eisenhower, over the course of his 2 terms as President of the United States, the impression that's given is that he is a Cold War warrior through and through. It's good versus evil, darkness versus light, all sorts, the same imagery, quite frankly, that Harry Truman was using. Not being critical of either one of them, that was the rhetoric of the Cold War. You do not want to give an impression in any way, shape, or form of being soft on communism, especially not in this very, very emotionally charged time in American history, especially the late 1940s, early 1950s. Well, for Eisenhower, on March 1st, 1954, the United States tested successfully this U.S. hydrogen bomb on Bikini Island. I referenced this in an earlier presentation. And the effects here, this was more than 100 times more powerful than the bombs that had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. And the Soviet Union, a short time later, would successfully detonate their own atomic bomb here. And from the standpoint of the radioactive fallout from the testing at Bikini Island, this U.S. hydrogen bomb being tested at Bikini Island, what you have here was radioactive fallout over the course of 7,000 square miles. And then reference the fact of Japanese fishermen becoming very, very ill. In fairness to the United States, as well as the Soviet Union, who are testing their bombs in the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, the issue here is they did not understand the dangers of radioactive fallout. Okay? I mean, it's something very, very new, and the impact that this would also have. The impact here that this would also have formally on the environment. Well, the Soviet Union, when they successfully tested their hydrogen bomb in September of 1954, it was not officially confirmed, though, until 1991. But the CIA was convinced that September 14th, 1954 was the date. The CIA ended up being correct. The United States and the Soviet Union are entering here a completely different age. Because in terms of hydrogen bombs, it was 100 times more powerful than what was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within 1 year after that, by 1955, they would have enough in terms of power in a hydrogen bomb that it was 750 times more powerful than what had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Eisenhower was very alarmed by this out-of-control arms race. And in 1955, he had a study done on a hypothetical atomic war between the United States and the Soviet Union. He learned from this very in-depth study in 1955, he learned the following. Number one, the Soviet Union would incur, in the event of a nuclear war between the two nations, the Soviet Union would incur 3 times the amount of casualties than the U.S. And this was because the United States had a much larger stockpile than the Soviets had. Number two, 65% of Americans, men, women, and children, 65% of Americans would require medical care. The vast majority of them would be unable to get it. Eisenhower told his cabinet here in 1955, the conclusion of this study, and I quote, "We would be digging ourselves out of the ashes and starting over," end quote. Publicly, Dwight Eisenhower is this hardline anti-communist. Privately, very different. Privately is very, very different. Eisenhower believed here, and you see this coming forth from his transcripts, from his meetings that he'd have with his cabinet, virtually all the time, the following. Number one, according to Dwight Eisenhower, communism was not a monolithic movement. It was not a monolithic movement, not this global movement in any way, shape, or form. He had stressed that the Soviet Union and China, these two great communist nations, they don't like each other. They're very competitive with each other. They're not cooperating at all. Second of all, the Soviet Union, Dwight Eisenhower would stress in these cabinet meetings time and time again, the Soviet Union had severe internal problems. Severe internal problems that, just like George F. Kennan was convinced in 1945 would destroy the Soviet Union from within, Eisenhower was convinced of the same. Both ended up, of course, being correct. Number three, communist ideology, as far as Eisenhower was concerned in 1955, and beyond for that matter, communist ideology was not the driving force behind Russian behavior. If Russia was a capitalist state, it would act the exact same way as it's acting at present. No doubt about it as far as Eisenhower was concerned. 4, the Soviet Union has no intentions of starting a war. This was one thing that he was 100% convinced of. So for God's sakes, they lost 30 million lives in World War II and the nation was completely destroyed. And now they're so stupid that they want to get involved in World War III? Absolutely, positively not. Not going to happen. Number 5, the conflict between Communist China and the Soviet Union was both real and serious. And what the United States needs to do here is to focus on trying to reduce tensions with both nations. Not necessarily play the role of a peacemaker, but try and understand, have a better idea that this is not a monolithic movement, that these two nations, communist states, hate each other, and perhaps it could be something that could help the U.S. in the long run. In 1955, Dwight Eisenhower said the following, and I quote, "We are in an arms race. Where will it lead us? At worst, to economic warfare. At best, to robbing every people and nation on earth of the fruits of their own toil." End quote. You have an image and a reality, therefore, of somebody completely different. John Foster Dulles was this hardline anti-communist. But what John Foster Dulles was stating publicly, what Dwight Eisenhower would also be referencing publicly, the opposite was the case. The opposite was the case. And what Eisenhower is looking for, what he is looking for, when he's going to meet here at the Geneva Summit for the first time with leaders from the Soviet Union to talk about the future, as far as he's concerned, we've got to think big picture. And we've got to think of some way of lessening the tension here in this nuclear age. When Eisenhower came to office, in 1953, the United States and the Soviets had enough in their respective nuclear arsenals to blow up every inch of the planet 3 times over. Just 4.5 years later, they had enough in their respective nuclear arsenals, these two nations, to blow up every inch of the planet 6 times over. Eisenhower's response to this was privately, how many times can you kill the same man? This is out of control. This is insanity. Again, publicly, you have to be very, very careful what you say, and indeed, he is going to be just that. Well, what happens here is for Eisenhower, as president during the Cold War, in February of 1956, Nikita Khrushchev is going to deliver this secret speech. Now, in the secret speech, Joseph Stalin had died in March of 1953. Joseph Stalin was a tyrant. He was the scum of the earth, for use of a better phrase, and it's not a phrase that I just throw around endlessly, not in any way, shape, or form. I would say probably the second most evil person to ever grace planet Earth. The first being Adolf Hitler, their contemporaries. Some historians would flip the two and say Stalin was worse than Hitler. I'd say, well, it's kind of like the depths of despair, who was worse. I'd give first prize in that regard to Hitler, with Stalin finishing a close second. But when he dies in March of 1953, everybody knew he was a tyrant across the Soviet Union. Everybody knew all about his crimes, but especially in the Communist Party, in the Politburo, the Central Committee, but you didn't talk about it. Well, almost 3 years after his death, in February of 1946, Nikita Khrushchev, who was his heir apparent, is going to go before the Soviet Central Committee, well over 1,000 of the top communists, and he's going to deliver this speech. Now, the speech was supposed to be secret, and Khrushchev is going to talk for a total of 9.5 hours.
Oh.
I know. You think it's a drag, perhaps listening to your friend Tim drone on for over an hour. Okay? 9.5 hours. And what he did, what he said, shocked everybody. Everybody knew it, but it shocked them. He talked first and foremost about how Joseph Stalin is going to, in the midst of this power struggle in 1925, come to power illegally. And then unleash his rage here on the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party, right out of the gate, following the death of Lenin. And second of all, he would set up in Ukraine this forced collectivization, which led to the deaths of literally millions of Ukrainian peasants who were shipped off on the Trans-Siberian Railroad to gulags across all of Siberia, where they were either shot, starved to death, or worked to death. You also have an artificial famine that Stalin manufactured here in Ukraine that took the lives of well over 2 million Ukrainians. They starved to death right in Ukraine. You get into the 1930s, and it's the Great Purge to get rid of these enemies. I mean, Adolf Hitler, for example, he did not have mental problems. There's no doubt about that. He wasn't normal, I would say. But he didn't suffer from mental illness. Joe Stalin, no doubt about it, suffered from paranoia to the extreme. And the more he killed, the more he had to. Everybody was out to get him. And in the Great Purges here, he is going to destroy the heart and soul of the Communist Party. He is also going to order the execution of well over 80% of the Red Army officer corps here by 1938. This is a time when the war clouds are blowing across historic Europe. And you've got this idiot in the Kremlin in Moscow who is murdering 80% of the Red Army officer corps. Who is going to protect your nation, Joe Stalin, in the event of a Nazi invasion? World War II begins. The Soviet Union is woefully unprepared. They'll lose 30 million lives. And even after the war, you have Stalin, who has fostered this cult of personality. It's all about Comrade Stalin, this Comrade Stalin, that. He's preparing for another great purge. Now he's going to be going after the physicians of the Soviet Union in early 1953. As the Russian newspaper Pravda talks about this doctor's plot, who are out to get the Soviet government. There's no doctor's plot. It was good fortune to have it for the physicians of the Soviet Union. Stalin suffers a massive stroke and dies. Well, what happens here is that what Khrushchev's secret speech is going to do is it's going to have an impact not just in the Central Committee of over 1,000 people listening here for these 9.5 hours. It's secret. It was not meant to get out. It leaks out all over. Eisenhower finds out about it. All the allies of the U.S. find out about it. The nations of Eastern Europe find out about it as well. And in 1956, in the aftermath of this secret speech, there's a significant falling out. First of all, in the Soviet Union, it becomes very, very strange because Stalin becomes a non-person. He had been in power from 1925 until his death in 1953. He was on permanent public display along with Nikolai Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union, in Lenin's tomb here. You can still go to Lenin's tomb and see Lenin on public display. Body immaculately preserved all these years later, now almost 100 years later. Stalin was preserved the same way, had been for 3 years. Well, in the dark of night here in March of 1956, his body is going to be removed from the tomb and buried underneath the Kremlin wall. His name will be removed from all Soviet textbooks. It's like he didn't even exist. Stalingrad, remember the big battle from World War II we talked about earlier this year, the key battle here in the European theater, will be renamed Volgograd. Well, you have many other things that are taken, but in Hungary, in the Iron Curtain, Eastern Europe sector, sits this hardline communist, Imre Nagy. And when Imre Nagy finds out about Khrushchev's secret speech, as far as he's concerned, it's ushering in a new period. And the Hungarians did not want to in any way, shape, or form any more than the Poles, or the Czechs, or the Bulgarians, or the Romanians, or the Yugoslavians, or the Albanians, the list goes on, the East Germans. None of them wanted to be dominated here by the iron fist of the Soviet Union. They wanted their independence. Imre Nagy is a hardline communist. And he introduces here in Hungary, in the city of Budapest, in 1956, that the communist state of Hungary is going to hold new elections. And they are going to allow for non-communist parties to participate in these elections. There's a great reform movement here, grassroots movement going on across Hungary for these changes, the winds of change that need to be enacted. Well, the question is, how is the Soviet Union going to react? And will the Soviet Union react? The Soviet Union reacts. Nikita Khrushchev is going to send the Red Army in, along with hundreds of Soviet tanks, rumbling into the city of Budapest. Over 10,000 people are going to die, the vast majority of them are civilians here, in the weeks that followed. Imre Nagy, hardline communist leader of Hungary, is going to be arrested. He'll be taken back to the Kremlin in Moscow, where he will be executed. Well, in this situation, it's a bit iffy in terms of what the future would be of communism in Eastern Europe. But this crushing of Hungary in 1956 sends a very strong message. Well, it will also be in 1956 the Soviet Union and China will experience the complete falling out. A rift here in the Cold War will develop between these two hardline communist nations, something that Dwight Eisenhower is 100% aware of, something that his vice president and countless others here in his administration, Vice President Richard Nixon, would also be aware of. And the Americans begin to think, in time, because this rift is so bad between these two nations, begins to think in time a way of maybe walking the middle of the road between the two communist states. Perhaps even improving relations, if that would be at all possible. Let the dust settle effectively. Mao Zedong, who is a superb revolutionary and an absolute failure as political leader of China, it would have been better for him if he had died in 1949 instead of remaining on power here in China until well into the 1970s. Is going to be very angry because he had been fostering this cult of personality. Chairman Mao, Mao's little book of sayings, the blue coat, the blue outfit, the equality of it all, etc. This glorification of the peasant class and the rural, peasant-dominated Chinese civilization. Well, what happens here is he's livid because Khrushchev gave this secret speech and he didn't warn Mao Zedong ahead of time. And Mao Zedong was following the exact same policies that Joe Stalin. By the same end, Mao Zedong begins taunting Nikita Khrushchev, saying that you have nuclear weapons, you need to use them against the United States. To which Khrushchev's response was, the United States has nuclear weapons too. It's not going to happen. Mao Zedong's response was, the U.S. is nothing more than a paper tiger, and you're a coward. Do not make a stand. These two sides end up at complete odds against one another. Nikita Khrushchev would start referring to China publicly as the yellow peril. Blatantly racist. He could care less. He could have cared less. What happens here is the split becomes so significant that by the late 1950s, under Tiananmen Square in Beijing, literally hundreds of miles of hallways were being built. They looked like hallways. I had a group of students in the University of Wisconsin there in the 1990s. And we got a glimpse of it. We saw it. But it's actually their bomb shelters. Because China was convinced that the odds were better than 50-50. That the Soviet Union was going to launch a nuclear strike on the communist nation of China. They weren't worried about the United States. They were worried about the Soviet Union. The Sino-Soviet split is permanent here in this Cold War. Well, for Eisenhower, there's a sense of optimism that there could be some way, perhaps in his second term in office, as he's going to run again in 1956 against Adlai Stevenson, and win again with tremendous ease, that in his second term in office, there will be a way of sitting down with the Soviets and coming up with some serious arms reductions. He knows it's stressful on the U.S. economy to keep up this arms race, and he also knows that the Americans here are having a difficult time adding more and more to their respective nuclear arsenal. The Soviets have to be unbelievably strapped because financially they're not even the top 20 nations in the world, not even close. So the Soviets are probably also interested. Nikita Khrushchev has a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for Dwight Eisenhower because of Eisenhower's prominence here is part of the Allied coalition during the Second World War. But yet another concern on the horizon here in the Cold War for the United States was Vietnam. Now, Vietnam was actually part of the French Empire in Southeast Asia, made up here of French Indochina, which was known collectively broken into three entities, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And here, during World War II, the Vietnamese in particular fought with the Allies against the Japanese. Because the Vietnamese were worried. They were worried with France knocked out of the war, World War II, in June of 1940, that now Japan, who was rolling into Vietnam, a classic example of the strong taking advantage of the weak, that the Japanese would now make Vietnam their satellite. And what the Vietnamese were looking for, as far as all of historic French Indochina was concerned, was an independent nation. They wanted nothing to do with the Japanese. They wanted nothing to do any longer with the French. Well, what happens is you have this rise of Vietnamese nationalism, and the Americans are going to send a tremendous amount of money to the Vietnamese nationalists to help them in their struggle in World War II against Japan. Well, when the war comes to an end in 1945, VJ Day, August 14th, a massive victory party was held in the northern part of Vietnam. And the leader here of this Vietnamese nationalist movement was a gentleman by the name of Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh is being recognized by the American soldiers, by the American officers who were there. And one of the nagging questions that the American hierarchy had at this victory celebration, honoring the Vietnamese fighting spirit against the Japanese, is that there were rumors going around that Ho Chi Minh was not only a nationalist, but he was also a Moscow-trained communist. And they asked him point blank, they said, Ho Chi Minh, I got a question for you before we set off. Thank you so much for everything, for all of your hard work, Ho Chi Minh, and all your forces struggling against the Japanese. Against Imperial Japan, we've emerged victorious. We owe a great deal to you. Are you a communist? Ho Chi Minh's response was as follows. Yes, I am. But can we still be friends? In 1945, French Indochina will come back once again fully under the jurisdiction of France. The Vietnamese don't want the French. The Cambodians, the Laotians, they don't want the French either. And once again, what you have here is you have this rise of Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese nationalists. Now, many of whom have attached themselves to communist ideology, and they are struggling against the French. They are struggling against the French. The French here have made a great deal of profit off of French Indochina, off of this region for decades, and as far as they're concerned, in the aftermath of World War II, they're holding on to this area as part of their colonial empire. Some colonies, yeah, no problem. North Africa, they'll let them go. They're going to try their best to hold on to Algeria, and Morocco, and Tunisia. Other areas they'll let go. Indochina is too profitable to let go. Comparable to the British letting go of India, their crown jewel as well here in 1945. So what will happen is this armed struggle will start between the French, allies to the United States, and the Vietnamese. And what the Vietnamese are going to do, what they're going to do is they're not going to take on the French in the open field here in the 1940s. Because of the Vietnamese army that have been trained to fight the Japanese, they know full well if they take on the French army first and foremost in the open field, they're going to be annihilated. They simply don't have the manpower, they don't have the expertise, most importantly, they don't have the weaponry. So what the plan becomes, or the goal, the objective becomes here on the part of the Vietnamese nationalists, is to, number one, avoid taking on the French army during the day in open combat. Number two, fight them only at night. Pull them into the jungle under the dark of night, where the Vietnamese know the terrain far better than the French do. More difficult to see, it'll level the playing field. Number three, eventually, France is going to tire of this, and they will withdraw and will become an independent state. This is the way the Vietnamese are going to fight against the French here in the late 1940s. Well, France, remember, is virtually bankrupt from World War II. So the French want to continue this struggle, but they don't have the financial wherewithal. By 1950, the United States here is financing 60% of this war in Vietnam for the French. 60%. By 1954, as now Dwight Eisenhower is the new president, by 1954, the United States is now funding 80% of this war between France and the Vietnamese. And the struggle on this yellow sector, this is Vietnam, of course, both the northern part as well as the southern part. The struggle continues. I'm pointing right here on our map to a small area. What I just pointed to in the map in this small area is a city in the northern part of Vietnam known as Dien Bien Phu. And in 1954, the Vietnamese Communist forces are going to surround the heart and soul of the French army at Dien Bien Phu. They're greatly outnumbered. It doesn't look good. The French immediately send word to the White House, to Dwight Eisenhower here in 1954, asking the U.S. president to send the U.S. Air Force over to bomb here, these concentric circles, to bomb the Vietnamese to push them back, so the French army can escape from Dien Bien Phu and fight another day. Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, is all for this. Dwight Eisenhower's attitude is absolutely not. Ultimately here in Vietnam, this is for the French to win or lose, not for the United States. Eisenhower sends word back to the French that we will not send our bombers over. The wisest course of action at this time for France, therefore, is to negotiate some end to the conflict, with the U.S. also helping, and still would be the case with the United Nations. Following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the negotiations begin. What will transition will become what is known as America's longest war, the Vietnam War, from 1954 all the way until 1975. It is also imperative to see this in the framework of the Cold War. Because just like Korea, when you ended up with a communist North Korea and you ended up with a capitalist South Korea, the same is now going to happen in Vietnam. When you're going to end up here with the UN intervention prompted by the United States, you're going to end up with Vietnam being partitioned not along the 38th parallel, but rather along the 17th parallel, into a communist North Vietnam and a capitalist South Vietnam. And how all of this is going to play out and what it means for the United States in terms of the big picture, we will see in our presentation next week. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Any questions? Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Today, what are the relations between, or are there any, between Russia and China? I see China as the up-and-coming power, for Russia in decline, and problems with that.
Excellent question. The question is, in the present, what the relationship between Russia and China. Historically, I would say it has always been based on one of mutual suspicion, to be perfectly honest. But for Putin in the present time, as the leader of Russia, he would be reaching out, quite frankly, to anyone he could have a shot at getting on his side, or at least being remotely sympathetic. What he also knows is that the reality here, from a global perspective, is that you have two massive economies. You have the U.S. economy and you have the Chinese economy. Two huge economies. There's always a talk going back to the 19th century, even prior to the American open, I should say not the American open door, but the open door policy of China, that if the Chinese get their acts together, China's got its act together. It really started, I'd say, in the 1980s during the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. China is a communist state with a full-blown capitalist economy. Right? Somewhere Marx has to be doing cartwheels in his coffin. For all intents and purposes, it's a capitalist state with a communist ideology. But what you have here is a situation that China, considering that it has 25% of the world's population, the US has 5% of the world's population, eventually is able to, following the disastrous leadership of Mao Zedong, is able to get itself on track, able to move forward, and is now able to compete effectively with the US. So you have these two nation states, and then after that it's a significant drop-off to Western Europe, which is also very, very wealthy. But the West Europeans are more tied to the United States. It's pretty much here a two-horse contest between the US and China. So what the relationship would be, because from the standpoint of China, looking at what's going on with Russia and Ukraine in this chess game, so to speak, they really don't want Sweden and Finland, who want to get into NATO and be close to the United States as possible for security reasons, and understandably so. If I were the Finns or I were the Swedes, I'd be doing the same thing, just like Norway is part of NATO. You have here a case that China is monitoring this closely because Europe, more and more, become closely tied even more so to the US, directly or indirectly. So the Chinese would not like that, and certainly the Russians would not like that. Russia still has these pretenses of going back to the great imperial age. To listen to Putin, it's laughable. I mean, versus the reality of Russian history versus his viewpoint on it, of the good old days. Couldn't be further from the truth. It's a backward nation. It always has been a backward nation. It's 100 years behind the times and remains as such. However, it does have nuclear weapons. So that's something that obviously plays a very significant role. So it's more of a sense of wait and see. What the United States is doing, in particular the State Department, is closely monitoring China. Because China would like this, because the United States could become ever more powerful, ever more prominent, and have ever more powerful and prominent allies, not saying militarily, but I'm saying economically. Because especially the Scandinavian states, they're very, very wealthy. Very wealthy. The West European states, they're also wealthy. They're not in the same league with the US, but it's comparable. And if you pull that region in, it could upset the balance of power, if that makes any sense. So it's more of a case of an incomplete grade at present. Who knows how long the war with Ukraine will last? Who knows how that's all going to end up? Kind of like something to stay tuned. Any other questions? If you have any other questions, swing on up. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here today. I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.